computer. All right. My name is Jeff. This is somebody who I think just about anyone and everyone who watches this channel with any regularity is familiar with. His name is KG Job.
You bastard.
Job, I am honored. This is the first time that, assuming we do put this out there, this will be the first time that you and I have been on the Randos channel together. So I am honored to share this space with you.
Don't make me regret it.
Well, I invited you. Well, I put out just a general invite to the Discord because I had an opening in my schedule to have a conversation, and you jumped on it. So we're having a conversation now. And one of the things we were talking about before we were recording was I'm interested because I haven't been as active on the Discord as I've been in the past, just focusing on some other things. But I'm interested in finding more out about how your ministry with your local church is going, the podcast that you're doing, how you're working in coordination with your pastor, and just see how all that's going. So just wanted to invite you to kind of tell the story just since it started, what's happened, and just see what happens from there.
Yeah, sure. That's been a kind of a strange ride. It's strange to hear it called a ministry because as far as I'm concerned, it's just me sort of doing things I think are nice to do. The podcast, Audible Faith, is going really, really well. Like we've hit the local papers, and like I think it was about 2 weeks ago now, my pastor sends me a text message saying, "Hey, this large Dutch religious organization, like the Dutch religious organization, the Evangelische Omroep, evangelical, what's that called? Radio, but it's not radio. It's radio and TV and magazines. It's kind of the main one. And they used to organize these big festivals. And they say, yeah, they want to do an interview about the podcast. I'm like, fuck. And I, okay, you deal with that. Like, I'm not getting involved. And I said, yeah, it's just going to be over the phone. I said, cool.
Oh, Joe, can I interrupt you for just a second?
No problem.
Would you mind backing up? And I'm sorry, I should have done this earlier. Can you just explain a little bit about the podcast and what it is, and then talk a little bit more about this, the interview?
Oh yeah, sure. Sorry, I dove right in. So a bit of background. As my role as the Discord pastor, I started having conversations with members, usually just asking them, what brings you to the Discord? I have another one in about an hour and a half. And you get to all sorts of awesome conversations. And that started with me just talking with Andreas, which never got recorded. And just became this thing. People would just DM me saying, hey, can I talk with you on a podcast? Like, sure. And I noticed it's just so easy because people are willing to talk. Mm-hmm. And it was just lovely. You learn all these things. I remember when I talked to Nick, he talked about all these denominations I'd never heard of. And it's just really nice to talk to all sorts of people. So then I figured, maybe I'm decent at this. Why not just do that with my pastor? Do something like that with my church. And that's people who are familiar with me know this story, but I've had some conversations with people who found out that I was religious, or at least they would think I'm religious. I have trouble considering myself religious. But they'd say that what I would tell them, which was mostly religious stuff or Petersonian stuff, was really helpful, but then they probably would never have come with me into a church, and I would have never come with myself into a church about 2 years ago. But I figured maybe if I'd know better what goes on there, what people find there, the questions they have, the discussions they have, maybe it would have been more interesting to me. And where am I going with this? At some point, my church had an opening for pastoral workers. So you go talk to people who are members of the church, and maybe they haven't been there for a while, and you go talk to them like, hey, how are you? How's church been for
Hmm.
you? And how's your life? How your family? This and that, whatever.
Was that something where did you say you would go to people's house, or that they would get invited to the church?
No, you go to the house. You
Okay.
get like assigned a segment, and that's kind of your area.
Okay.
And I signed up, and people were really positive. They said, "Sure, we'll raise you. We'll what's that called? We'll place your submission in front of the church council,
Hmm.
and we'll see where it goes." And so my pastor was really positive, but he also said, "Well, you're not really particularly religious. You're not really a Christian yet, as far as you yourself are concerned."
Mm.
So, and other people on the Discord who I talked to had been saying to me, "Well, how can you give people a spiritual aid if you don't believe in the promises of the faith?"
Mm.
That is a perfectly fair point. I thought that was a good point. So when my pastor wanted to talk to me about the whole pastoral worker thing, I said, well, we kind of figured out, let's not do this. Bad idea. Maybe in the future. And I said, well, what about the podcast? And he didn't know what that was. I said, well, but it's been really useful to me. It's like how I got into all this. It's like I listened to a YouTube video. That's how by Peterson. That's how I started exploring this stuff. And I said, what I'd like to do is have conversations with you, Pastor, about theological stuff. We could talk about like what's forgiveness, what's injustice, how can we deal with forgiveness, but also reconciliation. What's prayer? Why, stuff like that. But then also just conversations with members of the church. Like, what brings you here? Who are you? Tell me something about yourself, as Paul would say. And Pastor was really enthusiastic. So I did what I do. I registered a domain, set up a website, got a fancy microphone. And I kind of started asking people like, hey, would you be involved? Would you like to be on the Discord, on the podcast? And people were very reluctant. And I was like, that's odd. Why? I did an introductory episode with the pastor saying, hey, how did this came to be? Why are we doing this? Basically the story I'm telling you. And that was, people thought it was interesting. They also thought it was difficult because at that particular point, I was really into the problem of reasoning and materialism and philosophy. So my brain was just going into all sorts of sidetracks. So people thought it was useful, but I thought it was difficult. And then afterwards, we did one on prayer for the week of prayer, where every church in like 5 churches in town have each evening anyone can go. And then we have a prayer evening for like half an hour. So we did an episode about that. And that was well received because it was half an hour and I made sure not to be philosophical. And, but what I know is that people didn't want to go. Like, especially the people that I talk to, that I have the best discussions with about philosophy and books. And they're like, oh, no, I don't know if I want to do that. Like, but why not? Well, yeah, it's going to be public. Yeah, but it's like, we could just talk about a book you've read. We don't have to talk about your existential axioms. Yeah, but still. And like this from the same people who will, we will challenge each other's ideas with coffee after church, going, no, Rousseau was full of shit. And, and this is rubbish. Oh, you should read this book. You'd understand better. Like sometimes it's kind of pretty fiery. And I love that. But they don't want to come and sit with me and say, hey, what's a book you've read that kept you busy and how does that relate to your faith? And I got the previous head of the church council to show up. He's from 1947. And I asked him, hey, can you introduce yourself? And that was the entire episode for an hour long. Like he just, I just said, once in a while. And so, but what I think that is that it showed people like, oh, it doesn't need to be all, what is faith? What is God to you? You know, I don't ask everybody who God to them is. I only do that to people I like. And but then I record an episode with Emil. It's going to be published on the 8th. And he brought a painting that moved him. And he brought music that moved him. And we just had this, he's a school teacher, and we just had this beautiful conversation about children, about vulnerability, about the need to be able to be unhappy, and that we as a society have problems with that nowadays.
Mm.
And we just talked for about 45 minutes about all sorts of things. And he was involved with a particular church service in the Netherlands that was nonstop, like 24-hour church service for, I think, at least 2 weeks. So there would be just pastors taking each other place, like every hour, boom, new pastor, boom, new pastor. And then people would take shifts coming into the church. And that was, do you know this story?
Mm-mm.
This was a very particular church service because you cannot disrupt a church service as police and government. That's illegal, as far as I understand the background. That's and in that church, during that church service, were people from Syria, a family who would otherwise have been evicted from the country.
Mm-hmm.
And this way, we could keep them while their appeal ran. And they now live here. They were allowed to stay.
Hmm.
So he was part of that very special thing, very special church service that, you know, made news around the world.
Mm-hmm.
It was in this church in The Hague. It's just beautiful. And then we talked about that, like, what's it like to be a Christian? You know, how does that? And he calls himself a chronic Christian. Like he can't help being Christian. And like, I envy that so much. You know, he's a beautiful person. And we just talked for 45 minutes. And when we talk about the music, I have a little montage of the song he talks about playing under him talking. And
Oh, wow.
yeah,
You've got some production value on your podcast.
I have all sorts of audio tools, and yeah.
And you know how to do all that stuff?
Oh yeah, I have an intro and an outro. So I have a very good friend who's blind, and he's an audio producer.
Oh,
So he
wow.
makes jingles. And I said, hey, can I help? Can you help me make a jingle for my podcast? It's about this and this. He said, yeah, man, but he's from England and he was over here once. He says, you took me out for Indonesian food. Here's my list of free jingles. If there's anything in there, go nuts. Like, thank you, man. That's lovely. So it has an intro and an outro, and people have been pretty positive. We've had 3 episodes out now, but I've already recorded 3 more. Like my pastor is very active in victim help, especially domestic violence and sexual violence,
Mm-hmm.
and he organizes meetings about it. So he did an episode about that, like, what is injustice and how do we deal with that, and what does it mean to be forgiven? And I didn't need to do anything. I could just let him do his thing. And so that was like half an hour. We limit these at half hours, so it's like driving from here to Rotterdam. You can listen to an episode on your way to work. But I also had the current head of the church council, and like, people call me cagey. I could learn from. I mean, it was a good recording, but I understand why she was careful, because she's the head of the church council.
Yeah.
So, and I was trying to dig, you know, like, what's church to you, and what's it like to be and how do you deal with that? And she was like very,
Very
like,
guarded.
okay, guarded, yeah, which is fine. I cut it on time, like, hey, this is good. And like, the moment the microphones were off, she was like, pop, 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 pop. So that was obvious that she was just being careful. And we talked about music, so put some music in there too, and kind of make it work.
Well, Paul Vanderklee does say that YouTube, and I think this also extends to podcasts and the internet in general, if you're putting things out there, is a place for people with little to lose.
And he says that, and I know it, but I don't act like I know it. it's like someday this is all going to come back at me. Like they'll see these early recordings. I'm thinking, I look at these early recordings, like it's just some guy struggling with things. It's perfectly fine. So, but like yesterday, man, I had Rick, who I kind of, what's the right word for that? I kind of badgered him into coming on the show. He's 19 years old, and he studies politicology and relations between countries. And he's very, his faith is a big deal for him. He's an extremely smart guy, very educated, and he's been to Rwanda on a trip with the church.
Wow.
And before that, he did a whole study, and um, I don't know the English word for this, but like you study something and they hand in a report to your teacher
Hmm.
as an exercise.
Like
And
a
he did a whole
research
thing.
paper.
Yeah, exactly. And he did that on the genocide. So he was well prepared. And
Okay.
so we talked about like, how did it change your views on humanity? How did you find the people there? What was church like? Was it weird to come back into the Netherlands? And like, I had trouble getting stuff out of him. And that was fine because we eventually had 40 minutes, which I think is decent. But it was a beautiful conversation.
Mm.
And I tried to kind of dig at like, well, what's faith to you and what do you struggle with? And he didn't really seem to want to go into that, which is fine. Like he's young, he's got a social circle, he's got to be willing to be open about that. So I'm not going to push it.
Hmm.
But I think Discord spoiled me in the sense that people would already be really willing to tell me something. And
Yeah.
so I would have to cut them off at the hour saying, hey, if there's anything here you still want to talk about, we got 15 minutes left. What do you got? And here I have to learn how to ask questions to get them to come back to me. Because if I don't, they'll just look at me and I'm like, oh, they're not just going to tell me something else. I need to get something.
Yeah.
That's been difficult. But that's also maybe a skill I have to get.
Well, I think I can't remember. I think I was briefly chatting with Shelly about this on the Discord. But I was thinking about why people just felt compelled to reach out to Paul and actually wanted to have a conversation with him and have these deep things that they didn't feel like they had an avenue to talk about.
Mm-hmm.
And I think one very important factor was it's not just people reaching out to Paul randomly. They have been watching and listening to Paul. And so if you feel like you know the person to a certain extent, you have it's certainly a one-sided relationship when you're just always listening to somebody else talking, but you feel more comfortable opening up to that person. And so I think this is something that's common with just pastors in a church too. It's why people would be more willing to come and actually talk to a pastor and be very transparent with their lives toward a pastor, because perhaps, again, it's just a theory, they feel a level of trust there. It's like, okay, I've heard this person talk enough, I've heard their ideas, I've gotten a certain level of familiarity with who they are and how they think. And so I feel comfortable now opening up and just sharing things with them, because I feel like I know them a little bit.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so when I was talking to Shelly on the Discord, I was saying, I have a need to do this more in person now. But it seems like it would be there's a difficult hurdle that we have to figure out how to get over when it comes to encouraging people to open up. Because I was thinking about it in like a small group setting. Like my church and my pastor and the leadership there have been inviting people who are interested to start some small groups. And I've kind of bounced this idea off of my pastor and off of one of the other people on staff there, one of the other ministers. And it's really hard to explain kind of these conversations that we've been having here on YouTube and on the Discord and the things that Paul has been doing. it's hard to explain, and it's also hard to just say, here, go watch these 4, 5, 6, 20 hours of content to get a better idea of what we're trying, what I would like to see happen, more in real life, flesh and blood. So I've bounced that off of them, but it's been kind of difficult to articulate it, and I'm still trying to work out a way to present it. But I did get some positive feedback from the person who is like a spiritual formation director or minister at our church. I can't really describe what all that entails, but that's this person's title. And it's funny because I was saying, one of the things that I'd possibly like to do is have a session like an hour or two right after the end of the service on Sundays, to where if anybody just wants to come in and talk, particularly if they're new, but anybody
Yeah.
really who just wants to come and work out whatever issues they have in conversation. And she said this, she said, oh, wow, it would be almost like you could call it Sunday Conversations. And I was like, huh, that sounds like a good idea. So me and the pastor have to link up again and just talking about it a little bit. We've had a preliminary conversation about it where he's open to it. If it's actually a small group that's endorsed by the church, it has to follow certain guidelines. But he said it can focus on an interest as well. And it could be anything. It could be like a sporting activity. It could be books. When I started talking to the spiritual formation director about it, I said, well, if it has to be around an interest, I'd like to have a C.S. Lewis small group.
Yes, I was waiting for it.
Because that can go in so many different directions. You're an atheist and you're just showing up to church, but you don't feel like, it's a place for you. You just felt like coming one day. Come back here and talk. I can open up the atheist box on C.S. Lewis. If
Yeah.
you're, if you've been in church your whole life, we can talk about it there. It's interesting because one of the selling points that I shared there was it feels like, from what I can tell, at least in Christianity, I see 3 different lanes of Christianity as I'm learning more over the last couple years. I see obviously the Roman Catholic Church. I see the Protestants and everything that's often in that land of Protestantism. And then something that's newer to me that, as being someone who's come up in the land of Protestantism, just never really ever talked about, and that's the Eastern Orthodox Church. And so I haven't done any kind of deep study. I've just relied on what Luke has told me about it, in particular about how the Great Schism, came about and all that kind of stuff. And I'm sure if I talked to a Catholic, they would have a different take on it. But that's fine. I'm not here to start any fights. But the reason that I bring those 3 lanes of Christianity up is because all 3 of them seem to have a relatively high regard for C.S. Lewis and his thought. And so I feel like from a Christianity standpoint, if you're housing it within a Christian, particularly a Protestant Christian denomination standpoint, but there might be people coming into this church from all different facets of non-belief to, I grew up in some form of Christianity, Catholicism, Protestantism. I doubt anybody who's Eastern Orthodox would come floating into our church who left it, but who knows? Maybe so. But if we were just focused around what I know about C.S. Lewis, which, as far as I'm concerned, is not enough. There's so much more that I want to know. And I have yet to read a biography that anybody else has written on him. So the Narnian is on my list. I saw you were talking
Oh,
about
it's lovely. And the
but
poetry in there. Yeah, but go ahead.
But yeah, I'm on my project right now of just trying to read everything in the order that it was published, or roughly, I'm trying to follow his development of thought now from a very young age all the way up to right before he died. And I've read some some very popular works of his here and there over the last 15 to 20 years that I've just fallen in love with. But now I'm just trying to do a deep study of where he was and where he's going. And I just feel like, there are so many things, as everybody who's on the Discord sees, if there's a topic that comes up and I'm like, oh, I know that Lewis has said something about that, I'll throw my quote into the stream and just show you, oh yeah, here's something very interesting that he had to say about it. And I feel like there's a lot there to draw from, and a lot to connect to. And worst case scenario, if we kind of run out of fuel, I can just say, all right, we're doing a book study on this particular book for the next several weeks, and if people like it, that's great. If they don't,
Yeah.
and I'm hoping that if that doesn't work, the conversations can just turn in whatever direction we want them to go to. Now, like I said, there have to be certain guardrails up, and I would have to work out what those would need to be with my pastor, because if it's something that's endorsed by the church, certainly I don't want to cross any lines or break any trust or anything like that, right? But he has also mentioned, we could also just provide you space, because I did initially approach him in the meetup type conversation, to where there are people in it, and I did tell him a little bit about the Discord, and that there are people who feel like spiritually homeless, who find something, at least around the meaning crisis conversation and those type things. And so what I'm really trying to do is just square away what context I want to do this in, and I'm feeling more like it's moving in the direction of the church endorsed small group, because then I'll also have some collaboration or some teamwork with the church to kind of help market, I guess, for lack of a better term, at least get the word out to a group of people, or to people in the community, that say, hey, if you're looking for something like this. And probably what I will do is, as we're talking about it, and if we're both okay with it, share at least what you've just talked about in your conversation, just to show, hey, here's one particular avenue that we could pursue if we want to, but part of the thing that I'm dealing with right now is just kind of getting it clear in my head as to what it is that I even want to do to try to contribute to making a difference and making things better, whatever that means. And then once I have a better idea of what that is, actually being able to articulate that in a way that other people, particularly the leadership in the church that I go to, could get on board with, and not feel threatened by, probably isn't the right word, but just feel like, yeah, I think that from what it sounds like, it seems like that would be doing more harm than good. And so far, nobody has said that. I haven't gotten any responses like that, which I feel very hopeful about.
Just can't imagine churches not wanting to do this. Like, have you seen John Van Donk's initiative at Crosspoint Church in Chino?
I haven't. I remember Paul mentioning that they were talking about that and working on that. And I would like to have a conversation with either him or he and Paul, just to talk through, maybe what that is, and maybe even reach out to them and see if they might be willing to talk to my church leadership a little bit about it. So maybe we could help. That could help maybe paint a little bit more of the picture of what we could possibly do with it.
Yeah, I've tried something similar with my own church. Well, no, that's not entirely true. My pastor came to me saying, "Would you like to help with this thing?" Like, yeah, why not? So we sort of wanted a group for people who identify as secular, or consider themselves secular, or left the faith or whatever, and they just want to talk about stuff. And we're like, well, okay, so we'll have that at the fire department across the street from my house. It won't be in a church. And we could talk about, is there such a thing as good and evil, for instance? And I ended up making some flyers. We hung those up, and we asked around, and we networked a bit. And we had our first evening, I think 2 weeks ago, and one person showed up. Which, hey, it was a great guy. We had a great conversation. He was really enthusiastic at the end. Couldn't thank us enough, and he was going to be back next time. And here I was sitting at my desk minding my own business a couple of days ago. Some guy walks by, starts enthusiastically pointing at the flyer on my window, and So he's going to show up, and he lives a couple of doors down, turns out.
Hmm.
So that actually is going better than I thought, because if I were a secular person, I sure as hell wouldn't want to show up to something like that.
Right.
So, but there doesn't seem to be anything like this. Not in my village. It's all religion. Or, well, not the right word. It's all religious related. Like there's clubs, like chess, and, you know, ways to get people together, but not like what you are doing, and not like what I'm trying to do,
Yeah.
and what John and Paul are trying to do. And so, I mean, yeah, Godspeed, man. I hope you can pull it off. And I think the most difficult part is to get the people to come.
Well, it's interesting because when I did have a preliminary convo with my pastor about it, he's very familiar with the categories of the nuns and the duns in a religious context, right? Nuns being the people who, when polled, ask what is your religious affiliation, and they, Christian, non-Christian, atheist, they just pick none of the above, right? So that's where the term nun comes from for anybody that's not familiar. And then the duns are the ones who say, yeah, I think it might not necessarily be confined to Christian, but it could be, yeah, I was brought up in some type of a religious context. I believe in what I consider to be maybe a core tenets, but I'm just done with the institutionalization of it. I'm just completely done with church. And in the particular Christian context, a Christian dun would say, I still consider myself a Christian, push come to shove, but I'm just done. I'm just done with all the mess that has to do with church and all the problems that I have with it. It's just not a place for me. I'm not going to be there. I'd rather be someplace else. So they have various issues with it. And I say I'm a done. I've mentioned this before. I'm a done that's no good at being done. I continue to go to church, even though I feel like there are just a lot of aspects of it that don't connect with me. And some people have said, well, have you tried different denominations? Oh, of course, yes. I've only been to Eastern Orthodox once, and I'm not saying anything disparaging about Eastern Orthodox, but the different places that I go, I do feel there's a certain bit of homelessness to it. And so I am interested in having more conversations with people like that. But I also love having conversations with people who aren't done, who do go to church, who do find a great deal of meaning in it, who do love their tradition, who do love some of the things that I can't stand. I like being able to hear those stories and being able to interact with them and just hear the different ways that people think. Now, what's interesting, the reason that I bring up this whole nuns and duns thing is because, in the context of what I'm trying to do in my church, nuns you would almost frame it when you're pitching it to church leadership as this is a nuns and duns outreach. Nuns and duns don't want to be outreached to.
Exactly.
And so that's the
They'll come
issue,
if they want to.
right? That's the issue that I'm not sure how to overcome. And what's interesting about this whole thing that's happened with the Paul Vanderklay community is people found him. They started hearing things that they were interested in hearing about that they weren't hearing anywhere else. And they wanted to start having conversations, first with him, but then it just became too much. He's a bottleneck. He's one person. And, right around that time, everything lined up shortly after where Joey and the Sacramento meetup crew said, hey, let's create some other kind of community where a bunch more people can do this. And that's when the Discord was birthed. And so we found a bunch of other people and a bunch of other availability to have these conversations. And I don't know how you bring that into real life, particularly with that nuns and dun hurdle that I talked about, because it's like nuns and duns find what they're interested in out there on the internet right now, I think. or on TV or through some type of mass communication, because they're not going to church to find these things. I honestly don't know where they're going to be able to have these conversations.
But will they want to find real life interaction? Because that's what we're trying to achieve through the Discord.
I think they want to have conversations. I bet, and I don't want to speak for everyone, but I have a suspicion that many of the people on the Discords would love to have conversations with each other on the Discord, live and in person. Because a lot of us, at least I know I do, and some of the other people I've talked to on there feel like, yeah, I would love to be able to meet up in person for us to talk. I mean, it happened with you and I, right? We saw each other on Paul's videos and we're like, yeah, sure, I want to talk in person. Now,
Yeah.
I have admitted that I was a little hesitant initially. I can't remember if I told you that, but I think I've said this in another conversation. I was like, I don't know about meeting up with someone in person that I've just, only met on the internet, or not even really met on the internet, just shared a comment with on a random crazy pastor's YouTube video in his comments section. But I'm just like, nah, I've seen Job enough times. Yeah, he reached out. Why not? It's a short drive. Let's go meet up.
Short 4 hours. Actually, my wife has to go to the conference very likely in Texas again. Like, ooh, I should come along and I can go barbecue with Jeff. Like, I can't justify flying all the way to Texas just to barbecue with Jeff, or can I? Like, I don't know.
That's a good justification. You know what? After our conversation, we should have a talk and see how much it's going to cost.
Yeah. No, but the outreach to nuns and duns. Yeah, it is special the way that happened with Paul, but I think Paul was so open that when you talk to him, you don't get the impression that he's going to judge you or respond harshly or say, you're full of shit. He could have told me 20 times in these 4 conversations we had, Job, that shitty theology, where the hell did you get these stupid ideas? Because looking back, I tell myself that. But but jokes aside, I mean, the fact that he doesn't do that he listens, he's like, well, have you considered this, or how about that? Because, yeah, lots of nuns and duns, I bet, struggle. And then it's just nice to have a quote-unquote safe space where you can have conversations about interesting things. Like, for instance, you asked me, going back on the Lewis thing, you said, hey, I wonder what you think about C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity if you read it now. So I did. Well, I listened to it on Audible. But something like that that's interesting to non-believers as well. What do you think about that argument? I mean, he's still three steps ahead of me when I'm listening to it. That hasn't changed. But it's a wonderful book, and I understand it a lot better now. Yeah, I hope you can pull it off, man. It sounds great, and I'm glad your pastor is cooperative.
Yeah. So we'll see what happens. Our schedules have been kind of misaligned with different activities over the last couple of weeks. So I'm gonna I'll see him tomorrow. So I'm sure I'll have a brief little chat with him, but I'm going to try to connect with him again sometime in the next couple weeks. I've got family in town from Europe this week. So I won't have a lot of free time this week, but maybe the week after, I'll try to get together with my pastor and see what we can make happen.
Where in Europe? Italy?
Switzerland.
Okay.
I have family in Switzerland.
Okay. I don't know where I got Italian. I don't know. I figured your last name is Peace in another language, but
yeah, I've heard that maybe my name comes from Italian roots, but whenever we did like the DNA, the whatever it is, the heritage or
mm-hmm.
ancestry.com or whatever, I can't even remember which one it was now. Somebody somebody in my family gave it to me as a present. But it said, it's all, um, uh, where is it? I don't know. It seemed like it was very English and Anglo roots. I know that's probably a
Uh-huh.
surprise from looking at me, but surprise.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. I'm a strange mixture of French and German. What the hell do you expect? I'm from a long line of farmers.
Oh, this has nothing to do with anything at all, but you saying, a long line of farmers in English and French. And then I was thinking about where you are and that you're Dutch. There was a Spider-Man movie, Spider-Man Far
Oh,
From Home. Have you seen
that's
that scene
stupid.
where he goes
Yeah.
to the Netherlands?
Yeah. It's, that scene is so much bullshit.
Yeah, I figured.
I, I I recognized at least one of the actors, but and the Dutch is it's a proper Dutch people,
Uh-huh.
uh, but then he walks into a town that like what the hell? It's like that's like Middle Ages.
Yeah, yeah,
Like
yeah. It looks like it's a scene from Beauty and the Beast.
yeah, it's like what kind of country do they think this is? Very strange.
Well, it's the
I
same
mean,
thing that happens when Texas is represented in a very stereotypical fashion. And you've been to Texas, so it's not quite maybe what you were expecting. I don't know.
no, I mean, I was kind of expecting a bit more of the Dukes of Hazzard, but yeah.
Yeah. So, well,
It was, I mean, like it was a large state. Like they weren't lying about that, and it was very warm.
yeah, yeah. It's definitely those two things. It's not
Yeah,
so warm right now, but it's not cold either, which is why this is a really decent place to live, at least most of the year. Um, 3 months out of the year, some would say it's unbearable with the heat, but I know the heat is worse in places like Arizona and New Mexico.
mm, oh boy, it's
Particularly.
gonna be fun next month. Well, it can't be that warm there yet by that time.
You never know. You might get
Yeah.
lucky.
28 days from now, I'm like, oh no. I hope it will go okay. We'll see.
Yeah, keep trying to persuade those two to make a drive over to Texas.
I wish. I mean, we would have to connect to a church over there.
Well, I could work
Uh,
on that part.
I think John has schemed everything to the T. So I don't know how much stretch room there is, but
No, it's an incredibly long drive from there to Texas, so I couldn't see
there
that
are
happening unless you guys extend the trip by a month.
there are some trips in there that say 8 hours without stops. I'm like, fucking hell, what is wrong with you people? 8 hours.
What
That's
is that,
like,
a drive? What is that, a drive to Siberia from the Netherlands?
I think you end up somewhere at Moscow. Yeah, probably. Uh, yeah, we'll see how it goes.
Well, I know you've got
Um,
another conversation coming up, so I don't want to take too much of your time.
it turns out that guy actually has had a convo with Paul, so I should probably sort of catch up on that, see which that one was.
Okay. Well, I think this was good. I'll cut this off, and we'll decide to do what to do with it from here.